I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Naziema Jappie. I met Naziema last year, and as happens sometime, and I'm sure many of you would have experienced this, we immediately got along and spent 3 wonderfully interesting days together, to the extent that we were sort of sharing our life's woes, and I was sharing mine of the Institute, and the fact that we weren't able to put the faculty together, and she offered to come this year on her own expense. She has been an incredible friend to UPHeld and to the Institute in more ways than one, and I have no doubt that you will see her again very soon. More formally, Naziema has an MA in Social Sciences, in Industrial and Labour Studies, and a BA in Social Science, Psychology and Sociology from the University of Natal in Durban, South Africa. She has been active in the African National Congress and has been an active trade unionist for most of her working life. Currently, she is the Dean of Students at the University of Witwatersrand. Got it right, huh? Johannesburg. She is also a member of the Federation of African Women Educationalists in South Africa. She has attended conferences on gender equity in higher education at MIT, Harvard, Wellesley College, Radcliffe, and American Council on Education. Today, she is talking about women in the national struggle and women and human rights in South Africa after national liberation.
Firstly, I want to say thank you very much to Bunny. I'm going to call her that, thing that everyone does. When I came here, I said, "Who's Bunny?" And they said, "Well, she's Bunny." So I said, "Okay, I'm also going to call her Bunny." But thanks to her, and I think thanks to our friendship, that this interaction is taking place with both students and participants of the workshop today. But clearly, I think there are lots of similarities between South Africa and what I'm hearing in Pakistan. Firstly, I just want to say that I am South African. A lot of people ask me, "Are you Indian?" And I say, "Yes, I'm South African Indian because of Indian origin." And I think just to give a little bit of background on that, I think it's clear that my great-grandfather went to South Africa before partition. So clearly he's not from Pakistan. But I think a lot of people just assume that, you are an Indian and you are not South African. But I want to say clearly I am South African first. I'm going to talk about women in the national struggle and the women and human rights issues in South Africa. Clearly it seems to be a problem all over the world. And I think most of our problems are similar, and we need to see what we can do in order to try and get some recommendations through to our governments. I know you're finding it very difficult. So are we in the new South Africa. South Africa's first democratic elections in 1994 not only delivered victory for the ANC, which is the African National Congress, but also heralded a new era for women who have been the backbone of the liberation movement. I would like to begin this paper by actually just examining some of the issues during the Apartheid era and some of the historical events that actually contributed to the plight of women in South Africa, and then also to look at where South African women are today in the country. It must be understood that women suffered the triple oppression of class, race, and gender in South Africa. The issue of race, I think, is peculiar, and in particular, South Africa had race issues which were actually legislated. So during the apartheid regime, it became very clear that we lived separately. In that I meant we were classified separately. We were classified as Indians, as Africans, as coloreds, and as whites. And we basically lived like that. We went to school like that. We married like that. We basically all our lives were living separately, and we grew up in that way. So clearly there was no integration with any other population groups in the country, because if you did that, you were actually breaking the laws of the country. So clearly that legislation became something that people really resisted, simply because they were not wanting to have this separate development, and the word separate development means apartheid. But clearly there was no development for the people if you were not white. And the whites actually were very privileged, since they came in 1652 from Holland. And they were privileged in that sense in that they had the land to themselves and basically ruled from that premise. Therefore, we can actually characterize the era of apartheid which had 6 dominant features, and I want to go over these 6 with you. Firstly, there was a steady growth in the mining area, which actually brought in a lot of wealth into the country. Clearly, gold mining in South Africa is one of the key areas of wealth in the country. We also mine diamonds, and I was telling some of the students, and they said, can't we come to South Africa and get some diamonds? But clearly, this is controlled very, very well. It's actually controlled by the army, the areas where the diamonds are mined, but it's privately owned. So clearly, there is a connection between government and the wealth that's in the country. The second is the manufacturing sector, which is very, very highly and densely, the employment in that area is mainly women. And the state also does not control these. They are all privatized, but clearly has certain benefits to employers and not workers. And I think, therefore, when we discussed this morning, the whole issue of the trade union movement and why that came about, simply because workers were repressed. The fact that they were producing labor meant that they also needed to be given the incentives for their production and so on. So clearly that was the second area of concern. The third was agriculture, and agriculture is also a very, very large sector in South Africa, and it was promoted through the constructions of railway lines, etc., to provide access to markets. Mainly the rural women were forced into labor into agriculture because the lands of agriculture were nearer their homelands. And fifthly, the voting power, of course, was in the hands of whites totally. No black South African, whether you were Indian or colored or African, you were not allowed to vote. The first vote came in 1994, and you can imagine how excited people were when they heard that they were able to vote for their own government. So clearly, there was a lot of those voting issues which one needed to sort of abolish the laws, the legislations regarding that. The sixth and final characteristic identified as being particular significance was the search to find ways in which to keep wages low and also to keep people out of the cities. And the government used that very, very much to their advantage in the sense that they would use people's labor from the outside of the cities, but not allow them to stay in the cities. With the result, we had the pass laws introduced. The pass laws simply meant that if you were not a white person, you had to carry a kind of passport to come into the cities. And this was really frustrating for a lot of people. So it also forced men again to leave their homes, leave their families out in the rural areas, and come into the cities and work in the mines as migrant laborers. And I'm sure you're aware of that term. Clearly, it meant that the women had to stay back and take care of the house. The wives were not allowed to live with husbands. Under no circumstances you were allowed to come into the city, even to meet your husband on a weekend. It meant that he had to go home. So the pass law made the entry quite difficult into the cities. Women and children suffered these kinds of malnutrition, deprivation, material deprivation, high infant mortality, and also there was a disorganization of tribal life. Simply the people who lived in the rural areas were used to a tribal life. And when the man actually left the house, there was some sort of disorganization of that life. So clearly the women were also not used to being on their own because they had no idea of how to run a household, etc. The stresses of the family life had serious consequences for these women, especially with regards to health, and women had limited access to health facilities, and that hasn't really, even today, become something that's very accessible to women in the rural areas, and I'll talk about that a bit later. The distinctive characteristic of apartheid was introduced of tighter and more systematic, more comprehensive and strictly enforced control by the state over black people. The principal policy was the creation of what we called quasi-homelands. And basically, in crude terms, we used to call it the Bantu stance. And this meant that people were actually put into homelands, demarcated areas, to say that you would live in these areas. And if you go into South Africa today, you will still see people living in that type of area simply because they cannot move from one area into another very freely. They cannot afford to move from one place into another. So they stay where they are. And these homelands are quite clearly demarcated. So if you come in there, you will see there's Indian people living all in one area, there's African people living in one area. And clearly it is not a very healthy situation for the country because the integration is taking so slow. People's mindsets in terms of apartheid and what apartheid has done for them has clearly created a mindset that you cannot mix with other people. You cannot, your cultures are not the same. You cannot marry across the boundary lines. So clearly there are those restrictions still in people's minds, and they will not do it. And as I was saying to someone, for a Muslim to marry out into a Hindu was one problem, but to marry totally across color lines was out of the question. So clearly you would not be able to do something like that easily even today. Women also, I think the whole issue of the division of labor and labor at home emphasized that social division of labor took this added geographical dimension because people were in their homelands. In these changed conditions, the physical location of African women became more important to the perpetuation of African national oppression and colonial domination. In short, the oppression of African women has been integral and vital to sustaining the African national oppression, in changing the political, social, and economic conditions. Enormous and devastating consequences are seen in every aspect of social relations. For example, African women were physically concentrated in these Bantustans. Unemployment was and is still mainly concentrated among African women. They form sort of the poorest rung of the ladder. They bear the brunt of unemployment and they are denied the right to work. And they are very much dependent on their men for their income. A growing number of households are headed by women, and these women have no sense of any kind of socio-economic management, and they experience poverty and destitute. Waged employment for these women is concentrated in the semi and unskilled and the low-paying jobs. So clearly, you could see what the apartheid was doing to people. And that hasn't changed because clearly it's not easy to do it in the last 5 years. Women earned wages which were far less than their male counterparts. So even if you were a professional person and you worked in the university or you worked in any kind of institute, if the man did the same job as you, you'd get much less. So women's work was actually exploited. It is clear that African women constitute the poorest sector of the population in terms of the socioeconomic status. The women and other race groups were more economically active, but once again in respect of their class and race. And this is where I want to just talk to you about white women and how privileged they were in terms of having better education and all the better social facilities, which meant that they were upwardly mobile and they could manage their own homes, even if their husbands were away on business, in most cases, and rear their children in ways which were acceptable to their society. So clearly there was a clear distinction between the white females and the black females in South Africa. And they mostly occupied jobs which were professional in nature and supervisory in nature. The Indian women who also received education and who moved on also went into professional areas, but were very few. And mainly the women who worked in the Indian community worked in what we call the garment and the textile industries. So one need not go into depth about the rich history of how women's resistance has for decades fought to straddle the three interrelated strands of their oppression. But I just want to mention the three things that we recognize as very important to the liberation struggle as well as the women's movement today. The first one is the recognition by the national liberation movement that women are oppressed as women and that women's oppressions as social injustices has to be overcome. And even before the government of unity came into power in 1994, these were recognized clearly by the liberation movement. The second one was that it was necessary for women to organize as women and to overcome their oppression. The third was the recognition that women's struggle is an integral part of and not in contradiction to the national liberation struggle. So clearly for us, the issue was not a matter of whether we were women or men. It wasn't a gender question. It was actually the race question first. Because we had to, side by side, fight the apartheid regime. The 1980s faced a new era in South Africa, the formation of the United Democratic Front, of which of course I'm a product, within which the women's organizations were established that would resist the state at grassroots level by addressing the local concerns. And one of the main concerns was to work with women at grassroots level. And we wanted to engage in the local struggles, the local politics, and the local concerns of people at grassroots level. Political awareness actually grew stronger, and it was the right moment to demand specific issues relating to women. So clearly the UDF and part of the women's movement within the UDF was very strong, and because it was mainly made up of students and youth and people who were full of energy at the time, it clearly led the way to the liberation struggle. I want to just go on to talk about the transition into governance. Today's women is in an enviable state of transition. Traditional roles for women are being challenged on all fronts by social, political, and economic forces. It is thus clear that African national oppression has direct bearing on women's oppression. This, it would seem obvious to say that the ending of the national oppression is a necessary step to ending the oppression of the most downtrodden section of South African society, and that is the women, and especially the African women. But it is clear, even after the 1994 elections, that the national oppression might have alleviated, that overcoming the national oppression might have alleviated some of the burdens, but clearly it did not eliminate women's oppression in South Africa per se. With the women's movement just decades old, most adult women discovered enough self-awareness to be uncomfortable with traditional roles, while still operating out of the mental set to which they were socialized. And clearly that gave the impetus for ladies to actually stand up and fight for their rights, even with the new government in place. The situation in South Africa at the current moment is very dynamic, and the country is in a state of historical transformation. And people always say, well, how long are you going to be in this state of transformation? We've had 5 years to actually do that, and clearly not much has changed, because South Africa is still a racist and sexist society, and black women in particular suffer the consequences of this. Since the unbanning of the ANC and other political organizations, many progressive women's groups have got together to make demands that could not be effectively achieved through any individual political group. The ANC Women's League initiated the interest group which could make positive input into public structures. South African women lacked unity and feminist consciousness. The ANC Women's League, with all its effort, wanted solidarity among women, across class, across race, across cultures. And we wanted to fight patriarchy. The challenge, however, for women, especially for the black feminists, has been to shape South African feminism based on 3 assumptions. First, the identities of women are shaped by race, class, and gender. Secondly, we struggle to distance ourselves from white domination. And thirdly, fight, challenge, and transform black patriarchy, even though these men have been our allies and our comrades during the struggle for liberation. And that is something that's very clear today, even in the government, even in parliament. Clearly the men who stood at our sides and were our comrades are clearly not even understanding the plight of women and what women want to do. Some of them are very chauvinistic, and it's hard to get through to them in terms of what is really needed. One of the feminists writes about how to define feminism, and to define feminism purely in gendered terms assumes our consciousness or identity of being women has nothing to do with race, class, nation, or sexuality, just gender. But she says that no one becomes a woman purely because she is female. Ideologies of womanhood have much to do with class and race as they have to do with sex. So clearly that is something that we also need to put forward to our male counterparts. Thus, the liberation movement has created space for a new South African feminism. It has argued by some that this feminism differs from the conventional South African adopted Western feminism, in that it is based on black women's experience of multiple oppression, which includes the needs for things like clean water and housing. Examples of this type of feminism is in the rural women's movement and the Women National Coalition, which is both political and business-based. All women in South Africa are oppressed, but there are different degrees of oppression. And one has to understand this, and in order to illustrate this, if we look at the abortion rights that we have in South Africa, clearly it's the whites who are white middle-class women who are able to bypass the laws by flying to Europe and have their abortions done. Unfortunately for the blacks, it isn't that easy to fly off to Europe to have an abortion. Abortion is legal only under certain circumstances, and you probably have the same kind of laws, but clearly it is not something that is easy for women in the rural areas. The class issue is also contentious. For example, when we were having our negotiations over the rights of what we needed to include in the Women's Charter for effective equality, one of the participants in that negotiation got up and stated that the idea of clean water is really not an issue for women. And clearly this got the backs up of the rural women, because the rural women argued that it was important for them, since it was their responsibility to get water for cooking and cleaning, and it was their need, they needed that in the home. So clearly it was therefore an issue, and that they should not be separated therefore by class when it came to the Women's Charter. So those type of things do exist and still exist, because there's always the them and us issue, and one has to break down those barriers. One of the critical issues, though, presently is that of violence against women, and how this is being incorporated into the human rights framework for South Africa. Violence against human beings and women in particular has been one of the major factors which has prevented the realization of human rights goals in the 20th century, and I'm not sure what's going to happen in the 21st century. For the past 5 years, women from around the world have been campaigning for the recognition of women's rights as human rights, and the integration of gender perspectives into all areas of human rights, practice and theory. By doing this, it will enable us to understand issues such as health, bodily integrity, economics and social justice. But the low status of black women in South Africa is further compounded by this extreme form of violence they have been subjected to in the past and are still subjected to presently. Violence against women in South Africa has reached its endemic proportion. It is a serious one, and it's very, very problematic. And I've been hearing throughout my stay here about violence in this country, violence and abuse against women. And I think it's something that needs addressing seriously. According to the United Nations special reports on violence against women, South Africa has one of the highest rape statistics in the world. This is by no means decreasing. We hear of rapes every day, and many go unreported. Clearly on our campuses, in our schools, even among children. Violence against women is an ever-increasing problem. It extends to violence at home, into society, and has become a method of systematic assault on femininity. Women are vulnerable because of their sexuality, which results, of course, in things like rape, female genital mutilation, etc. Because they are subjected to man, domestic violence, dowry, death, where men think that they own women, or they belong to social groups where violence against women is a mere humiliation directed at the group. And clearly we must understand that, I'm not so sure in your society, but in South Africa, in the African society especially, when marriages take place, it's not between two individuals clearly, it's between two groups. And that is why we have this kind of humiliation taking place, which is directed at the group. As stated in the preamble to the United Nations Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, it is a manifestation of its historically unequal power relations between men and women. Violence is part of a historical process and is not a natural or born of biological determinant. And I think that question of natural is very clear. The system of male dominance has historical roots in its functions change over time. Violence against women reflects the general culture of violence in South Africa and normalizes violence and affirm its role as a conflict resolution tactic, simply because South Africa has been a culture that has a lot of violence because of its resistance movements. And men have seen that, taken it to its extent in terms of violence against women as being something normal. So clearly it's not seen even by African men or Indian men or white men that if I hit my wife, there's something wrong with it. She's my wife after all, I can do what I want. So clearly there is that culture of violence in the society itself. The ideology of apartheid was concisely and specifically engineered and applied in the form of structure and policy embedded in the constitution to control movement and social relations. Men who abuse their partners design and implement power and control tactics over their victims with the intention of keeping them in their place. So clearly, it was nobody's business if a man hit his wife. And during the apartheid time, nobody bothered. Besides physical injury and socio-economic neglect, abuse kills a person's spirit, and I'm sure you all will agree. Clearly, a person's ability to freely and deeply make emotional contact with others becomes a problem. The abuse of power in apartheid and the domestic violence destroyed people's sense of self. And clearly the whole regime and its whole structure destroyed our nation. Apartheid introduced stratification into society through ethnocentrism, class distinctions, hierarchies, power and control. It was an inherently abusive system and thrived within the patriarchal tradition. So clearly for us it was a huge problem, one which we are still facing, still trying to get through and change people's mindsets. South African women remain second-class citizens despite the changes in the country since the first elections in 1994. Violence against women is a human rights violation, and as a signatory to CEDAW, which is the Convention on Elimination and Discrimination Against Women, the government has to guarantee the rights of women to be protected against violence through its policies, plans of actions, departments and programs. South African women have stated that the legal system is particularly hostile to women. It seems to exacerbate the situation rather than find solutions. South Africa has a very progressive constitution, and everywhere you go in the world they'll tell you that South Africa's constitution is very, very progressive. But what does that say for us as women? Clearly, the economic and the social and legal inequalities still exist. Although the Ministry of Justice has put violence against women on its agenda, women, regardless of race, complain of indifferent or hostile treatments from the criminal justice system. Despite their good intentions, police are frequently ignoring the laws protecting women from violence. The Justice Department, however, launched the Prevention of Violence Against Women campaign in 1996, in November 1996. And of course, this led to another campaign for dealing with sexual violence cases. Nevertheless, with all the campaigns, it meant nothing, simply because we are still faced with justice personnel who are arrogant, insensitive, and patriarchal. Some magistrates still feel that women need to be disciplined and that they entice men, and therefore they exacerbate the matter without weighing the cases properly. So clearly a lot of the cases that do go to court, and 70% of them, are clearly then just thrown out of court because the women cannot give evidence, she cannot have a lawyer, etc. So there's a lot of problems still with the justice system. Some magistrates still refuse to issue court interdicts and insist on peace orders that are not powerful at all. And the interdict itself, unfortunately, has a lot of loopholes. Clearly, when we talk of interdicts, when a man and a woman are having problems, the court will issue an order for the man to stay away from the women. But in most times, they ask the women to leave the home and then issue the interdict to the man saying, you mustn't go near her. So clearly, there are those problems that one has to deal with. Abuse against women manifests itself in different forms: psychological, sexual, and economical, disempowering acts of violence. It differs from place to place, and it occurs at different times. Women are vulnerable, especially if it is known that their husbands are away, and the rural women are subjected to these. Because clearly we have what we call vigilante groups who go around the rural areas. When they know that men are not around, they take advantage of women, even children. And more children between the ages of 4 and 6 are being raped in South Africa. The Department of Health has made it easy for pregnant women and children to receive medical treatment free of charge. Yet we find that district surgeons are a real disappointment in our country in terms of dealing with crisis situations. Victims of rape and domestic violence do not receive treatment on time. Sometimes you will find the woman will wait for a whole day, maybe 2 days, so that she can get treatment. And by that time, she's so tired that she forgets about it and doesn't forget about it, but decides, I'm going home now, I can't wait any longer. The findings of the Human Rights Watch are such that our situation in South Africa is still very abusive, and that we are not at all well trained in this area, clearly because we do not have the resources to do so. A lack of housing is another major problem, because women who are abused find it difficult to leave home since they are not in a position to obtain alternative accommodation. Property rights in many customs remains with the husbands or with the sons, and clearly is not a woman's business at all. The Department of Welfare, however, has been doing some work, and they have a program which they call Victim Empowerment Program, whereby it is committed itself to innovative strategies to counter abuse and violence, to establish supportive structures for individuals and families, in order to reduce poverty levels by providing capacity building training, economic empowerment, and community development programs. But again, whenever it is programs to deal with women's issues, the budgets are that small. So clearly, the departments cannot do much with it. The Department of Welfare also recognizes that customary marriages do not have the same legal rights as civil marriages, and particularly impacts on women's social benefits, custody and guardianship of children, property, land, and inheritance. This is a serious problem for women in urban areas where they are in danger of losing their properties when their husbands die. So clearly there is a lot of that debate at the moment in the country in terms of how do we look at customary marriages that coexist with civil marriages. The status of women in South Africa today clearly shows that the subordination of women is further compounded by these marital regimes. In civil marriages, before December 1984, wives were considered as minors, legal minors, in a sense that they had to seek their husband's permission if they wanted to do anything. So if you were married in a certain way in the civil courts, then you were a minor. You could not do anything. You could not even open a bank account. You could not sign a lease. But since 1988, those have been abolished, and now at least the women feel a little bit more free to run their own businesses, etc. However, the laws relating to domicile and guardianship still remains in South Africa with the husband. So clearly there are contradictions, okay? There is no clear indication of how one deals with customary marriages, and I've been going on with this for quite a while now at the Institute, talking to the students, talking to other people. And clearly the Constitutional Court in South Africa seems to handle these cases, but yet have no idea in terms of how to deal with these and find solutions. So you can have a wonderful constitution, but you can have very flawed laws in the country. There is also African marriages, which is crucial to understand that the value of the family is very important. And like I said, the marriage takes place between families rather than individuals. So it's actually an alliance between two kinship groups. In such a marriage system, the man acquires rights over the women and children, but women do not enjoy reciprocal rights. Clearly, women are viewed as property and are disempowered through the system of what we call lobola, the bride price. The men are secured by the movement of cattle, which has a direct bearing on the subordination of women. So if a man wants to marry a woman, he has to make sure he has enough cattle so that he can hand over to the bride's family. And each cattle has a price because the mother's cattle is the most expensive. So clearly the mother and the father are the key people in a marriage, and the cattle that you would give to them is one of high price. And then it goes lower, and the last one is for the girl herself. So she has the cattle with the lowest price. Now it's become a very expensive way of trying to give bride price, because cattle, of course, is part of our agriculture, and clearly they cannot afford the bride price at most times. The same, of course, does not apply to Muslim women, but in South Africa, clearly the Muslim women face similar status as their African counterparts. Although the Bill of Rights in South Africa outlaws discrimination on sex, the question to be asked is how such safeguards of fundamental rights might coexist with the recognition of Muslim personal law. Muslim women are subjected to male domination, as well as male-dominated religious bodies who continue to regulate their lives in accordance with traditional interpretations of Islamic law. And clearly it shows, because in the country that you are in at the moment, which is Pakistan, it's very different to the way we do it. If a woman has to get nikah, she does not even sign the paper. So forget about even knowing whether you are married or not. And clearly it is done by proxy. Your uncles ask you if you're still going to get married, and they marry you. So clearly you have no say in what you want or what you want to do. And of course, divorce is the right of the man, not the women. So clearly there are those distinctions in terms of how people interpret laws, etc. I want to actually conclude by saying that the South African Constitution enshrines the principle of non-sexism and equality for women. It also specifically prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. New legislation in all spheres is being enacted. The government has established an office on the status of women and has also put into place gender commissions, which is responsible for monitoring and implementing the commitments made through CEDAW and in conjunction with the Human Rights Commission. But with all this, we still have some criticism of the government. Firstly, the government has failed to develop a clear understanding at different levels of things like violence against women. The government has programs but has not implemented them. The government has also failed to translate policy into programs. It has failed to give enough budgets or financial support to programs for women in the country. The police have not been trained and are still stuck in the Apartheid era and are not very sensitive to women's issues. People think that if legislation changed, then the problems will be resolved, but unfortunately, that is not the case in South Africa. Clearly, the country is still in a process of trying to find its feet. However, even with all this machinery in place, we still find that men pay lip service to these issues, and in this deeply entrenched across cultures, classes, and communities in South Africa. Thank you very much.